My name is Henry. I'm in my early 40s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been defined by steady things: marriage, work, showing up when I said I would. I'm not the loudest person in the room. I've never been. People usually describe me as reliable, calm, maybe even a little predictable. The kind of man you assume is doing fine because he doesn't complain. And that assumption, that quiet equals content, was the first misunderstanding. If you'd met me a few years ago, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. I blended in easily. At family gatherings, I was the one refilling drinks. At work, I was the guy who handled problems without escalating them. In my marriage, I was seen as solid background noise, useful, present, but not particularly examined. I don't say that with bitterness. It's just how roles form when you don't fight for attention. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic confrontations or explosive reveals. It's about something slower, and in many ways more unsettling. I found out my marriage was a lie after 12 years. Not all at once, not through a confession or a shocking scene. It came together quietly, the way truth often does when you finally stop explaining things away. One message proved everything I believed was fake. A single moment that didn't scream or accuse. It simply sat there, undeniable, changing the meaning of everything that came before it. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of how that realization unfolded. How subtle dismissals turned into patterns. How silence, first accidental, then intentional, became a form of clarity, and how choosing not to react immediately gave me something far more powerful than anger: perspective. This is a story about emotional justice, but not the kind that demands an audience. It's about psychological reversal, not through manipulation, but through restraint. There are no villains twirling mustaches here, no shouting matches, no miraculous wins, just adults making choices, and one man finally seeing his own life clearly. I'll walk you through who I was in the eyes of others, the role I accepted without questioning it, and the moment that role stopped fitting. I'll share how I prepared in silence, how consequences began before anyone noticed, and how the truth, once visible, couldn't be negotiated away. Most importantly, I'll be honest about my blind spots, about the cost of staying quiet for too long, and about what it actually feels like to step out of a life that looked stable from the outside but was hollow in ways I couldn't name for years. If you're listening to this because something in your own life feels slightly off, but not bad enough to justify concern, I understand that space very well. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without pressure. Have you ever sensed that the story you were living didn't quite match the one you were being told? For a long time, I thought being dependable was the same thing as being valued. It turns out they look similar from a distance, but feel very different when you're the one living inside them. To my wife, I was steady Henry. The man who handled bills without reminders, the one who never forgot birthdays, even when mine passed quietly. I was the person she described to friends as low maintenance, which sounded like praise until I realized it mostly meant convenient. I didn't demand emotional explanations. I didn't push back when plans changed. I absorbed friction so other people wouldn't have to feel it. At work, I was the same version of myself, the operations manager who fixed problems before they became visible. If something went wrong, I stayed late. If a deadline slipped, I rearranged my own life to compensate. My name wasn't attached to big wins, but it also wasn't attached to failures, and that made people comfortable. I was dependable enough to trust, quiet enough not to threaten. Friends saw me as the balanced one, the guy who listened more than he spoke, the one who didn't overshare. When conversations drifted toward complaints about spouses or careers, people would glance at me and say, "Well, Henry's got it figured out." I usually smiled when they said that. It felt easier than correcting them. What none of them seemed to notice was how rarely anyone asked what I wanted. Not in a dramatic way. No one was cruel. No one told me I didn't matter. It was subtler than that. Decisions were made around me, not against me. Assumptions filled the space where conversations should have been. Over time, my agreement became automatic. So automatic that people stopped checking for it. In my marriage, this showed up in small ways. Vacations are planned based on her preferences because you're flexible. Social commitments accepted on my behalf because you don't mind. Emotional topics were redirected because you're not really affected by that stuff. I became easy to manage because I managed myself out of the equation. And here's the uncomfortable truth. I helped create that version of me. I believed that staying calm was the same as being strong. Not reacting meant being mature. I told myself that love didn't require constant reassurance, that long-term commitment meant accepting imbalance during stressful seasons. Every time something felt slightly off, I explained it away with logic. Relationships aren't always equal. Marriage goes through phases. Don't keep score. So I didn't. I stopped noticing how often my presence was assumed rather than appreciated, how my silence was interpreted as consent, how being the good one slowly turned into being the invisible one. If you had asked my wife during those years who I was to her, she would have said all the right things. Supportive, loyal, safe. She would have meant them. But none of those words require engagement. They describe a foundation, not a partner. And foundations don't get asked how they're holding up. The strangest part is that I didn't feel unhappy all the time. Life was functional, predictable, externally successful. That made it harder to trust the quiet discomfort that followed me around like background noise. When nothing is obviously broken, you learn to doubt your own unease. So I stayed. I showed up. I kept being useful. To them, I was the man who would always be there. What I didn't realize yet was how dangerous that assumption would become once I finally stopped being invisible to myself. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves as injuries. They feel like accidents. Moments you replay once, then let go of because holding on to them feels petty. This one came disguised as a joke, delivered casually in front of other people. The kind of moment that disappears if you don't catch it mid-air. We were at a small dinner with friends. Nothing formal. Wine, familiar faces, the low hum of conversations overlapping. Someone asked my wife how we made decisions so easily. Finances, schedules, long-term plans. She laughed and said, "Oh, Henry's easy. He doesn't really have strong opinions about that stuff." People smiled. Someone nodded approvingly. I smiled too. But something inside of me paused. It wasn't that the statement was entirely false. I was flexible. I did avoid unnecessary conflict. But hearing it framed that way, like my lack of protest meant lack of depth, created a quiet dissonance. I remember thinking, that's not exactly true. Then immediately correcting myself, it's close enough. Don't overthink it. Everyone moved on. The conversation shifted. No one noticed that I'd gone quiet, because quiet was already my default. Later that night, after the guests left and the dishes were stacked to dry, I almost brought it up. Almost. The words hovered somewhere behind my teeth, but I pictured how it would sound. Oversensitive, defensive, unnecessary. So instead, I asked something neutral about her work. We went to bed like normal. That should have been the end of it. But the moment stayed with me. Not emotionally, mentally. It replayed at odd times, not charged with anger, just curiosity. Why did it bother me? Why hadn't she checked whether that description felt accurate? Why did everyone accept it so easily? Over the next few weeks, similar moments surfaced. Nothing dramatic, just small, clean dismissals. A plan changed without discussion. A personal preference was overridden with, "You don't care either way, right?" A story told about me simplified my role until it fit neatly into a sentence someone else needed. Each time I noticed. And each time I told myself it wasn't worth addressing. Relationships are built on compromise. Pick your battles. Don't turn minor things into problems. What made these moments dangerous wasn't their size. It was their direction. They all pointed the same way. Outward. Away from me. I began to realize that once people learn you won't push back, they stop bracing for resistance. And when there's no resistance, there's no pause. No moment of checking in. You become part of the environment, not a participant in it. The hardest part was that no one else saw it as disrespect. Friends laughed. Family nodded along. From the outside, everything looked harmonious. If I had voiced discomfort, I would have been the anomaly, the man disrupting the peace over something small. So I stayed quiet. But silence, I was starting to understand, doesn't erase awareness. It sharpens it. I began paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not obsessively, just observantly. I noticed how often my agreement was assumed before it was given. How my absence from decisions was framed as trust rather than exclusion. How being low maintenance slowly became a justification for neglecting engagement. And still, I didn't confront it. Not because I was afraid, because I wanted to be sure. There's a difference between reacting and recognizing. I wasn't ready to react. But I was learning to recognize patterns, and patterns take time to reveal themselves. One cut is an accident. Two is a coincidence. There is a trend. By the fourth, you stop asking if it's happening and start asking why. That's when I understood something uncomfortable about myself. I had been so committed to being reasonable that I'd made myself easy to erase. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just gradually. The first small cut didn't hurt because of what was said. It hurt because of how quickly it was accepted. By everyone. including me. By the time you notice something is wrong, you've usually already learned how to live with it. That's what normalization does. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly lowers the bar of what you expect, one moment at a time until you forget there ever was a higher one. After that first small cut, I started seeing the pattern everywhere, but not in a way that felt alarming. More like background static. I told myself this was what long-term relationships looked like. Familiarity breeds efficiency. You stop asking questions because you think you already know the answers. In my marriage, decisions became increasingly one-directional. Not argued, just settled. Plans were made, then presented. Emotional topics were filtered before reaching me, as if someone else had already decided how much of myself I needed to access. When I noticed, I didn't push back. I rationalized. She's under stress. I'm more adaptable. This is temporary. That last one became my favorite explanation. Temporary has a way of stretching itself into years if you let it. At work, the same dynamic deepened. I became the solution, not the stakeholder. My calendar is filled with responsibilities that weren't technically mine, because I didn't complain when they were handed over. People stopped asking if I had capacity. They assumed I would make it work. And I did. What I didn't see yet was how this mirrored my marriage almost perfectly. I was reliable enough to depend on, quiet enough to overlook, and reasonable enough to accept imbalance without naming it as such. Disrespect rarely looks like cruelty. More often, it looks like efficiency. People streamline around the parts of you that don't resist. The most unsettling part was how quickly I began participating in my own erasure. I preemptively downplayed my preferences. I answered whatever you want before anyone asked. I stopped offering opinions unless I was sure they aligned with the room. It felt mature, it felt controlled, it felt safe. But underneath that calm was something else, something I didn't have language for yet. A dull awareness that my presence was becoming optional in my own life. Friends would say things like, "You're lucky, you don't get worked up like the rest of us." They meant it as admiration. I took it as confirmation that I was doing something right. What I didn't notice was that no one asked what I felt. They commented on how little I expressed. There's a difference. In quiet moments, driving alone, standing in the shower, staring at my reflection while brushing my teeth, I would feel a brief flash of something close to resentment, not toward anyone in particular, toward the situation, toward myself, maybe. But I pushed it down quickly. Resentment felt dangerous, like the first step toward becoming someone I didn't recognize. So instead, I became someone even harder to recognize, a man who was present everywhere except internally. The normalization reached a point where subtle dismissals stopped registering as events. They became expected. When my wife forgot to tell me about a decision until after it was made, I shrugged. When my input was summarized instead of quoted, I accepted it. When my emotional reactions were predicted instead of asked for, I nodded. The moment something shifts from surprising to expected is the moment it starts shaping you. And here's the part I don't hide from. I chose quiet because it preserved stability. Speaking up risked disrupting the image of harmony we'd built, and I had invested too much in that image to question whether it was mutual. But stability without reciprocity is just slow erosion. I began telling myself a story about who I was. The calm one. The adaptable one. The man who didn't need much. That story explained everything and excused everything. Until it didn't. Because no matter how much I rationalized, my body kept the score. Tension I couldn't name. Fatigue that didn't match my workload. A sense of distance in my own home that no amount of logic could bridge. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was disappearing in real time. And the scariest part wasn't that others didn't notice. It was then that I started to believe this version of me was all I was ever meant to be. Roles don't usually arrive with formal introductions. No one sits you down and explains who you're expected to be. They form quietly, through repetition, through what you tolerate, through what you don't interrupt. By the time I recognized mine, it had already hardened. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the man who would handle whatever needed handling without asking for much in return. In my marriage, that role came with unspoken expectations. I would be understanding, flexible, emotionally contained. I would absorb stress rather than redirect it. I would provide certainty so others didn't have to sit with discomfort. It wasn't a malicious assignment. It was practical. When one person consistently accommodates, others unconsciously reorganize around that behavior. My wife didn't wake up one morning and decide I should be invisible. She learned slowly through experience that I wouldn't object, that I wouldn't escalate, that I would adjust. So she stopped checking. I noticed it in how conflicts were handled, or rather, how they weren't. Disagreements were softened before reaching me, edited down to conclusions. Emotional distance was framed as peace, And any time I did attempt to express concern, it was met with reassurance rather than engagement. "You're overthinking. It's not a big deal. You know I appreciate you." Those phrases sound kind. They are kind. But they also close conversations. They confirm that the system is working as intended. At work, the role was even clearer. I was the person people leaned on when things got complicated. The one trusted with sensitive transitions, quiet fixes, and long-term cleanups. My reward was more responsibility, not more authority. More trust, not more voice. I told myself that this was leadership, that influence didn't require recognition, that being essential was better than being visible. But somewhere along the line, I realized I wasn't being chosen for these roles anymore. I was being assumed. The role didn't ask what I needed, it defined what I would provide. Once you're assigned a role like that, stepping outside of it feels disruptive. People react with confusion, not hostility. They don't argue, they look surprised, as if you've broken character in the middle of a familiar scene. The few times I hesitated, I saw it immediately. A pause, a recalibration, someone stepping in to fill the silence I usually occupied. The system is correcting itself. So I stayed in character. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to be seen as unstable or demanding. I had built a life on being dependable, and I was afraid of what would happen if that foundation shifted. What I didn't understand yet was that I had mistaken usefulness for belonging. Belonging invites your presence. Usefulness only requires your function. In my marriage, this distinction showed up in small, revealing ways. Celebrations centered on others. Emotional labor flowed outward. My inner life remained largely unexplored, not because it was hidden, but because no one asked. And I had trained them not to. That realization landed quietly one evening while I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, long after everyone had gone to bed. The house was silent. I wasn't upset, just aware. Aware that if I stopped performing my role, everything would feel slightly off, but no one would know exactly why. That's when it hit me. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't respected. I wasn't even misunderstood. I was predictable. Predictability is comforting to others, but it's dangerous when it replaces mutual attention. When people stop wondering about you, they stop seeing you. I didn't confront anyone after that realization. I didn't announce a change. I didn't demand renegotiation. But something internal shifted. For the first time, I stopped asking how to maintain the role I'd been given. I started asking a quieter, more unsettling question. What happens if I don't? The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no confession that split the room in half. It happened on a weekday afternoon, ordinary enough that I would have forgotten it entirely, if not for how it changed the way I listened to everything that followed. I came home earlier than usual that day. A meeting had been canceled, and I decided not to replace it with something else. That alone was unusual. I was always filling gaps, optimizing time, and making myself useful. That afternoon, I just wanted quiet. The house was still. My wife's phone was on the kitchen counter, screen facing up. It buzzed once, not loudly, just enough to catch my attention. I wasn't looking for anything. I didn't feel suspicious. I wasn't checking. I was passing by when I saw the preview light up. One message. A name I recognized, but not in the way you recognize friends or coworkers. More like someone you've heard mentioned just enough to register as familiar. The message itself wasn't explicit. No affair revealed in a sentence. No undeniable evidence of betrayal. In isolation, it could have meant almost anything. But context does the real work. The tone, the timing, the casual intimacy of it, the assumption of access. It didn't read like someone reaching out. It read like someone continuing something. And suddenly, every rationalization I'd built over the years lost its footing. I didn't open the phone. I didn't scroll. I didn't confront her. I didn't feel a surge of anger or panic. What I felt was clarity. Cold, precise clarity. Precise. The message wasn't the truth. It was the confirmation. In that moment, my mind didn't race forward. It moved backward, replaying conversations, re-examining absences, reinterpreting emotional distance that I had previously labeled as stress or fatigue. I realized that what I had been experiencing wasn't neglect born of overwhelm. It was disengagement, not accidental, not temporary, chosen. I sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there for a long time. Long enough for the initial shock to settle into something more stable, something heavier, but also more solid. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a participant who had finally been given the full script. The shift wasn't emotional, it was structural. Up until that day, I had been trying to fix a relationship I believed in. After that moment, I understood that the relationship I believed in no longer existed in the form I thought it did. And that changed everything. When my wife came home later, I didn't mention the message. I didn't test her. I didn't ask questions I already suspected the answers to. I listened, not for lies, but for patterns. And the patterns were suddenly obvious. Details omitted. Emotional responses rehearsed. A tone of reassurance that felt more like management than connection. She wasn't hiding in a panicked way. She was hiding in a practice one. That's when I understood something critical. Whatever this was, it had been happening long enough for my absence from her inner world to feel normal. That realization hurt more than the idea of betrayal itself. I went to bed that night next to someone I had loved faithfully for over a decade, and for the first time, I felt like I was observing rather than participating. Not numb, not detached, just awake. The shift wasn't about deciding to leave. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about certainty yet. It was about no longer needing to explain away what I could now see clearly. From that day forward, silence wasn't avoidance. It was an intention. Before that day, my silence had been reflexive, a habit formed from years of choosing harmony over friction. After that day, it became something else entirely. It became deliberate. I didn't withdraw. I didn't grow cold. In fact, if you were watching from the outside, you might have thought things were improving. I was calm, attentive, present in all the ways I had always been. The difference was internal. I stopped offering information I wasn't asked for. I stopped filling conversational gaps out of discomfort. I stopped preemptively smoothing situations that weren't mine to manage. And almost immediately, I noticed how much space that created. People are used to certain rhythms. When you change them quietly, it goes unnoticed without triggering alarms. My wife didn't notice the silence itself. She noticed the absence of predictability. She asked more questions, checked in more often. Not because she felt closer, but because something familiar had shifted and she couldn't name it. At work, the effect was similar. I still did my job well. I just stopped rescuing other people from the consequences of their own decisions. Problems didn't disappear as quickly. Meetings took longer. People had to clarify things they used to assume I would just handle. No one accused me of anything. No one could. I hadn't changed my output, only my availability. And that distinction mattered. Silence, when chosen, becomes a form of structure. It forces others to reveal how much they relied on your unspoken labor. What surprised me most was how often my restraint was misinterpreted. People assumed I was tired, or distracted, or going through a phase. Some thought I was being passive-aggressive. Others assumed I was simply coping. No one considered that I might be observing. I began listening differently, not to words, but to patterns. What was volunteered? What was avoided? What required reassurance and what didn't? When something important was shared only after it had already happened. The more I listened, the more consistent it became. I started documenting, not out of paranoia, but out of respect for reality. Dates, conversations, shifts in behavior. I didn't assign meaning prematurely. I just recorded. This was new for me. I had always trusted memory. But memory softens things. It edits. It excuses. Documentation doesn't. At home, I noticed how often intimacy was replaced with routine. How emotional questions were deflected with humor. How concern for my inner life appeared only when my behavior deviated from expectations. That was the clearest signal of all. Care triggered by disruption isn't care, it's maintenance. Still, I said nothing. Not because I was afraid of the truth, but because I needed to understand the full shape of it. Silence gave me access to information I'd been too busy smoothing over before. And something else happened during that time. Something quieter, but more important. I stopped feeling confused. The tension that had lived in my body for years began to loosen. Not because things were better, but because they were clearer. I wasn't fighting ambiguity anymore. I wasn't trying to reconcile contradictory signals. I accepted that I didn't yet know what I would do. But I knew what I would not do. I would not confront without understanding. I would not accuse without evidence. I would not act from shock or wounded pride. That decision alone gave me back a sense of agency I hadn't realized I'd lost. Silence had always been my default. Now it was my boundary. What they never noticed was how much room silence creates when no one is rushing to fill it. While everything on the surface appeared unchanged, something methodical was unfolding beneath it. Not dramatic, not reactive, just deliberate. The kind of preparation that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need permission. I kept my routines. Same commute, same tone of voice, same reliability. That consistency became my camouflage. People relax when they think they know what to expect from you. They stop watching closely. And that's when you learn the most. I paid attention to timelines. When conversations overlapped. When explanations came prepackaged. When details appeared only after decisions were final. I noticed how often I was the last to know about things that directly affected me, and how natural that felt to everyone else. including her. I didn't interrogate. I didn't set traps. I let reality speak at its own pace. The leather notebook I'd carried for years, once filled with work notes and reminders, began to change purpose. I wrote dates, phrases that stood out, inconsistencies that repeated. I didn't interpret them yet. I just preserved them. At work, my documentation habits sharpened. Emails are summarized instead of assumed. Follow-ups confirmed instead of implied. I made sure decisions lived somewhere concrete, not to protect myself from catastrophe, but to protect myself from denial. Because denial isn't loud, it's subtle. It creeps in when you want things to be simpler than they are. At home, I began noticing absences that had nothing to do with time. Emotional absences. Places where connection should have been, but wasn't. And more importantly, how little effort was made to bridge those gaps unless I disrupted the rhythm. That told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. I also began learning, quietly, about finances, about legal frameworks, about how people disentangle shared lives without turning them into battlegrounds. Not because I had decided to leave, but because not knowing felt irresponsible. Information is neutral. What you do with it determines its weight. I reviewed accounts, not obsessively, carefully. I made sure I understood what was shared, what was separate, and what existed only because I had assumed transparency. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden in the shadows. Just clarity replacing assumption. The most revealing part of this phase wasn't what I discovered, it was what I didn't. There was no sudden remorse, no spontaneous re-engagement, no curiosity about my inner world unless my behavior deviated. I wasn't being monitored because I was trusted. I was being overlooked because I was expected. And expectation is a kind of blindness. What they never noticed was that my silence wasn't empty. It was observant, focused, grounded. I wasn't waiting for permission to act. I was waiting for certainty. There's a difference. Certainty doesn't come from a single message or a single lie. It comes from alignment. When what you see, hear, and feel finally stop contradicting each other. That alignment arrived slowly, then all at once. I realized that I wasn't gathering leverage in the way people imagine. I wasn't planning a reveal. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was preparing myself to be unmovable, to make decisions that wouldn't collapse under pressure, guilt, or second-guessing. And the irony is this: the more grounded I became, the less angry I felt. Anger requires friction. Clarity doesn't. By the time I was done observing, documenting, and learning, I didn't feel like a man waiting for something to happen. I felt like a man who already knew. They never noticed the shift because nothing outward demanded their attention. But inwardly, everything had changed. The private reveal didn't arrive with shock. It arrived with stillness. By the time it happened, I wasn't searching anymore. I wasn't piecing things together late at night or replaying conversations in my head. I had already accepted that something fundamental had shifted in my marriage. What I didn't yet have was closure. Not emotional closure, but structural truth. That came quietly, through a combination of patience and pattern. One evening, while reviewing shared accounts and archived messages, not obsessively, just methodically, I noticed something I had skimmed past before. A timeline inconsistency. Not large enough to raise alarms on its own, but precise enough to resist explanation. Dates that didn't line up with stories I'd been told. Overlaps where there should have been distance. A recurring name that appeared only in the margins of our life, never in the center, never acknowledged directly, but never fully absent either. I cross-referenced, slowly, carefully, not to prove betrayal, but to understand the shape of reality. And that's when it became undeniable. The message I'd seen weeks earlier wasn't a beginning. It was a continuation. Evidence that whatever connection existed had survived multiple opportunities to end, and hadn't. There it was. Not dramatic, not explicit, but complete. I didn't feel my chest tighten. I didn't feel rage surge through my body. What I felt was something closer to gravity, an internal settling, as if pieces that had been floating finally clicked into place. This was the truth I'd been circling. Not just infidelity, but replacement. Not physical absence, but emotional relocation. She hadn't drifted away accidentally. She had invested elsewhere while keeping the structure of our marriage intact, because it was functional, reliable, and safe. And I had helped maintain it. That realization hurt, but it didn't destabilize me, because by then, I wasn't emotionally dependent on uncertainty anymore. I sat with that knowledge alone. I didn't write about it immediately. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront her in a rush of righteousness. I let it settle, because reactions fade, but understanding lasts. I asked myself questions that were difficult but necessary. Had I been cruel? No. Had I been absent? No. Had I ignored early signs to preserve comfort? Yes. That mattered, not as self-blame, but as self-respect. Because clarity without accountability becomes resentment, and I wasn't interested in carrying resentment forward. The private reveal wasn't about exposing her. It was about freeing myself from doubt. From that moment on, I stopped wondering if I was misreading things. I stopped questioning whether I was overthinking. I stopped asking myself if I was being unfair. I wasn't, and knowing that gave me something more valuable than leverage. It gave me direction. I understood then that whatever came next couldn't be negotiated emotionally. It had to be handled with structure, timing, and restraint. Not to punish, but to preserve dignity. Mine and, surprisingly, hers. Because once you see the truth clearly, you stop needing to weaponize it. You just need to act in alignment with it. I didn't sleep differently that night. I didn't treat her differently the next morning. I didn't reveal what I knew. But I was no longer guessing. The lie wasn't something I had to expose. It was something I had already stepped outside of. There comes a moment after clarity where doing nothing becomes a decision in itself. That's where I was. I knew the truth. I wasn't speculating anymore. And yet, I didn't move immediately. Not because I was frozen, but because I understood something important. Once I acted, there would be no neutral ground left. So I paused, not to delay, to choose. I laid out the options as plainly as I could, without emotional distortion. I could confront her immediately, say what I knew, watch the conversation fracture into explanations, apologies, denials, or partial truths. I could demand answers, timelines, and assurances. I could seek emotional resolution in the moment. But I knew myself well enough to know what that would cost. Confrontation in that state wouldn't be about understanding. It would be about release. And release doesn't build anything. It just empties you out. Another option was to stay, to absorb the knowledge quietly and continue the marriage as it was, reshaped by realism rather than illusion. People do that more often than they admit. They accept emotional absence as the price of stability. They renegotiate expectations internally and move forward. I considered it seriously. 12 years is a long time. Shared history exerts gravity. There's comfort in familiarity, even when it's compromised. Leaving would dismantle more than a relationship, it would dismantle an identity. But staying would require me to become someone else entirely, someone smaller. The third option was irreversible. Not explosive, not dramatic, just final. To begin disengaging, not emotionally, but structurally. To prepare for an ending that didn't rely on permission or mutual agreement. To reclaim authorship over my own life quietly, before announcing the next chapter. That option required patience, discipline, and the willingness to be misunderstood. For a while. It was the hardest one, because it meant living in the presence of someone who didn't yet know that the version of me she depended on was already gone. I didn't make the decision in one night. I lived with it for weeks. I tested it against different emotional states, calm, tired, and nostalgic. I asked myself if the choice still made sense when I wasn't feeling strong. It did. What tipped the scale wasn't anger. It was alignment. I realized that the marriage I thought I was preserving no longer existed in mutual form. Continuing to participate in it without disclosure would mean colluding with a lie, not hers, but my own. And I couldn't do that anymore, so I chose the irreversible path. Not because I wanted to hurt her, not because I wanted justice, but because I wanted coherence. I wanted my actions to match what I now knew to be true. The decision wasn't loud. It didn't come with a sense of victory or dread. It felt clean, like setting something down after carrying it too long. From that moment on, everything I did had intention behind it. Not secrecy. Intention. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was planning an exit. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not externally. Life continued at its usual pace. Mornings, meetings, dinners, routines. But internally, I shifted into something more deliberate. Every action had weight now. Not emotional weight, strategic weight. I didn't announce anything. I didn't withdraw affection in ways that would raise suspicion. I didn't provoke conversations that would force premature confrontation. I understood that silence, at this stage, wasn't avoidance. It was protection. I began with structure. I consulted professionals quietly. Not to build a case, but to understand pathways. What separation actually looks like when done without hostility. What steps create clarity instead of chaos. I asked questions I never thought I'd need to ask, and I listened carefully to the answers. Knowledge doesn't rush you, it steadies you. I organized finances, not to hide anything, but to see everything clearly. Shared obligations, individual responsibilities, long-term implications. I made copies of documents I had always trusted would be there when needed. Trust is not the same as preparedness. At home, I maintained consistency, the same calm presence, the same reliability. If anything, I became more even-tempered, not because I was suppressing emotion, but because the internal noise had quieted. When you stop arguing with reality, you conserve a surprising amount of energy. My wife noticed something, though she couldn't articulate it. She asked if I was okay more often, not with concern, but with curiosity. I answered honestly, without revealing direction. I'm fine, I'd say, and I was. The most difficult part of this phase wasn't logistical. It was ethical. Moving in silence carries responsibility. I had to ensure that my restraint didn't become manipulation, that I wasn't staging an outcome or collecting sympathy. So I checked myself constantly. Was I acting in alignment with my values? Was I allowing space for dignity on both sides? Was I choosing clarity over control? Those questions mattered more than any legal step. At work, I quietly adjusted timelines, reduced dependency, delegated responsibilities that had been overly centralized around me. Not as a signal, but as preparation. If I were going to change my life, I needed to ensure I wasn't leaving chaos behind. People noticed, but misinterpreted it. They assumed I was finally prioritizing balance, taking care of myself. They were right, in a way, just not in the way they imagined. What no one noticed was that I had stopped building my future around assumptions of permanence. I planned with flexibility now. I imagined possibilities that didn't include her, not with bitterness, with realism. This phase lasted longer than people expected, months, not weeks, because rushing would have turned a clean break into a collision, and I had no interest in collisions. By the time I was done preparing, there was nothing left to scramble for. No panic moves, no reactive decisions, just a sequence of steps, already rehearsed internally. Silence had done its work, and the irony is this: the more prepared I became, the less I needed the truth to be acknowledged. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was ready for alignment. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They don't knock. They don't explain themselves. They just begin, quietly, altering the shape of things until people sense loss without knowing its source. That's how it started. I didn't change how I spoke to my wife, but I stopped compensating emotionally. I no longer anticipated her needs before she voiced them. I didn't smooth over moments of distance with reassurance. I stayed present, but neutral. At first, she seemed relieved, as if the absence of friction meant things were stabilizing. She filled the space with activity, plans, and conversations that didn't require depth. But soon, something else surfaced: confusion. She began checking in more frequently, asking if everything was okay, not because she sensed anger, but because she sensed absence. I was there, but not oriented toward her in the way she had grown accustomed to. I hadn't withdrawn love. I had a withdrawal adjustment, and that changed the dynamic. At work, the ripple was more visible. Projects slowed. People had to take ownership of decisions I used to absorb. The system adjusted, but not without discomfort. Meetings grew longer. Accountability shifted. People noticed my presence in new ways, mostly because they now felt its limits. No one accused me of abandoning responsibility. They just felt the difference between support and substitution. That distinction matters. Socially, I became harder to place. Friends sensed something was different, but couldn't label it. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't fill the silence with humor or reassurance. I didn't volunteer personal updates unless asked directly. People interpret silence in revealing ways. Some assume strength. Some assume withdrawal. Some project their own anxieties onto it. I let them. The most telling changes came at home. Small disruptions surfaced, plans forgotten, expectations unmet, moments where she realized, too late, that she had assumed something I no longer provided automatically. Her responses shifted from casual to corrective, from confident to searching. What's going on with you lately? You feel different? Did I do something? Each question carried an edge of uncertainty, not guilt. She wasn't afraid of having hurt me. She was afraid of having lost influence, and that told me everything. I didn't answer those questions directly. Not yet. I acknowledged them without resolving them. I've been thinking more lately. I'm just paying attention. Statements that were true, but incomplete. The consequences weren't dramatic. They were cumulative. A missed emotional cue here, a delayed response there. The subtle realization that I was no longer orienting my choices around maintaining her comfort. I wasn't punishing her. I was reclaiming myself. And once that shift occurs, people feel it instinctively. She tried to re-engage, but not in the way someone does when they want to repair. It felt more like recalibration, like testing old levers to see if they still worked. Affection appeared on schedule. Concern emerged when routines shifted. But curiosity about my inner world remained surface level. That was the final confirmation I needed. The consequences weren't teaching her empathy. They were revealing dependence. And dependence, once disrupted, doesn't resolve through reassurance. It escalates. By the end of this phase, she was unsettled, not angry, not remorseful, uncertain. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for people who rely on predictability. I didn't enjoy watching that discomfort, but I didn't intervene to relieve it either, because this time it wasn't my responsibility to stabilize what had been built on my silence. By the time she realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. Not because I was unwilling to listen, but because the version of the relationship she was trying to return to no longer existed. It had been built on assumptions I was no longer willing to uphold. Her tone changed first. The casual check-ins became serious. The light questions turned into careful ones. She began choosing her words with more precision, as if sensing that something essential was slipping beyond reach. "I feel like you're pulling away," she said one evening. Not accusing, observing. I didn't deny it. I just didn't rush to reassure her. "I'm not pulling away," I said. "I'm standing still." That confused her. It was meant to. She tried a different approach. More openness, more shared stories. She offered fragments of vulnerability, but only enough to restore balance, not enough to disrupt the larger pattern. It was an effort, but it was reactive. And reactive effort doesn't rebuild trust. It only responds to threats. She asked if we should take a trip, if work stress was getting to me, if something external was bothering me. Each suggestion framed the problem as temporary, fixable with adjustment rather than truth. I listened. I acknowledged. I didn't commit, because at this point, commitment without alignment would have been dishonest. The hardest moment came when she asked quietly, "Do you still want this?" Not me, not us as we are now. This, the structure, the familiarity, the version of marriage that required my emotional absence to function. I told her the truth, but not all of it. "I want honesty," I said, "and I want reciprocity." She nodded, too quickly. Promises followed, vague ones, assurances that things could change, that she would try harder, that we could work on it. But effort offered after leverage is revealed always arrives late. Not because it's insincere, but because it's incomplete. She still didn't ask what I had seen. She still didn't ask what I knew. She still didn't ask how long I had felt this way. Those questions would have required vulnerability she wasn't prepared for. So instead, she offered solutions that preserved the framework, hoping I would step back into my role. That's when I understood that repair wasn't possible, not because trust was broken, but because awareness was asymmetrical. I was living in truth. She was still negotiating comfort. By the time panic entered her voice, my decision had already solidified. Panic doesn't invite dialogue. It seeks control. And I wasn't willing to be managed back into silence. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I didn't reveal the full extent of what I knew. I simply stopped participating in the illusion that effort alone could bridge a reality gap. It was too late to fix it. Not because she couldn't change, but because I had already changed. And once that happens, the relationship either evolves fully or it ends cleanly. The confrontation didn't happen in the way people imagine. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no moment where I laid out evidence like a prosecutor closing a case. By the time we sat down to talk, I wasn't carrying urgency anymore. Urgency belongs to people who still hope the past can be rewritten. I waited until the timing was clean. No distractions, no time pressure, just two adults sitting across from each other at the same table we'd shared for years. I told her I needed to talk, not about us, but about reality. That word landed differently. She started by apologizing for the distance, for stress, for not being as present. She spoke carefully, watching my face for reactions, adjusting her tone when she sensed I wasn't following the script. I let her finish. Then I said calmly, "I know." Not accusatory, not emotional, just factual. She asked what I meant. I didn't list dates. I didn't quote messages. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. "I know this marriage hasn't been mutual for a long time," I said, "and I know why." Silence followed. Not explosive silence, heavy silence, the kind that forces honesty to choose whether it will show up or not. She tried to explain without confessing. Circumstances, confusion, feeling disconnected. Nothing explicitly denied. Nothing is fully admitted. I didn't interrupt. When she stopped, I said the most important thing I had learned during all those months of quiet observation. "This conversation isn't about convincing me of anything," I said. "It's about understanding that I'm no longer willing to live inside a story that requires my absence to work." That's when her composure broke. Not into anger, but into fear. She asked if I was leaving. I answered honestly, yes, not immediately, not with hostility, but with certainty. She asked if there was anything she could do. And this was the hardest part, not emotionally, but ethically. I told her the truth. "If you had asked these questions before, I said. "We might be having a different conversation, but you're asking them now because something has changed in me, not because something changed in you." That distinction matters. I didn't blame her. I didn't recite her failures. I acknowledged my own silence, my role in allowing imbalance to grow. But I didn't accept responsibility for sustaining a dynamic I had already stepped out of. There were tears, quiet ones. There was disbelief, not about what I knew, but about how calm I was. Calm unsettles people when they expect collapse. The conversation ended without resolution because resolution had already happened internally. What we were doing now was alignment, bringing external reality up to speed with internal truth. I didn't leave that night, but I did leave the illusion that confrontation was about winning or losing. It was about naming the moment where two paths diverge and refusing to pretend they don't. I'm not the man I was when this story began. Not because I'm harder, not because I'm colder, but because I'm no longer shaped by avoidance. I don't define strength as endurance anymore. I define it as alignment. After everything was said, after plans were made, logistics handled, and silence finally gave way to truth, I spent a long time alone. Not lonely, just alone enough to hear myself clearly again. The first thing I noticed was how quiet my body felt. The low-grade tension I had carried for years was gone, not replaced by joy or relief, but by steadiness. When you stop managing other people's expectations at the cost of your own, something fundamental resets. I didn't rush to redefine myself. I didn't reinvent my life overnight. I kept my routines. I went to work. I exercised. I cooked for one. I let things feel ordinary. Ordinary is underrated when your nervous system has been in constant negotiation. What changed was internal orientation. I no longer ask whether my reactions are convenient. I ask whether they're honest. I don't pre-edit my needs to make them easier to accept. I state them calmly, and I let others decide how they want to respond. That alone filters a lot of noise out of your life. I've learned that being low conflict is not the same as being low impact. That quiet people still need to be heard, especially by themselves. And that silence is only virtuous when it isn't self-erasure. I still value restraint. I still choose calm. But now those choices are grounded in self-respect, not fear of disruption. I don't regret the years I spent being dependable. They taught me discipline, patience, and perspective. But I no longer confuse those traits with worth. I also don't carry bitterness. Bitterness ties you to what hurt you. Clarity lets you move forward without dragging the past behind you. I understand now that people treat you based on the boundaries you enforce, not the loyalty you offer. And boundaries don't require volume. They require consistency. The most unexpected change is this. I feel visible to myself. I notice when something feels off, and I don't explain it away. I asked questions earlier. I listen to discomfort as information, not as weakness. And when I'm quiet now, it's because I'm choosing to be, not because I'm afraid of what speaking might cost. That's who I am now. Not louder, not harsher, just aligned. There's a lesson in this story that took me 12 years to learn, and it has nothing to do with betrayal. Betrayal is loud. It gives you something obvious to react to. What almost broke me wasn't what happened in the end. It was what happened slowly, quietly, while I was busy being reasonable. The real danger isn't being lied to. It's learning to live in a version of your life where your absence becomes normal. When you're calm, adaptable, and dependable, people rarely mean to misuse those qualities, but they do organize their lives around them. And if you never interrupt that pattern, your needs don't disappear. They just go unanswered. Silence isn't strength if it's rooted in fear of disruption. Loyalty isn't a virtue if it requires self-erasure. And love, real love, does not survive on convenience alone. What gave me peace wasn't exposing the lie. It refused to continue participating in it. I didn't win. I did not punish. I didn't reclaim power by taking it from someone else. I reclaimed it by returning it to myself. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about coherence. It's the moment when your internal truth and your external actions finally align. Without theatrics, without spectacle, without needing validation. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Pay attention to what you normalize. Not just in your relationships, but in how you treat yourself. If you're always the one adapting, ask why. If your silence keeps the peace but costs you clarity, notice that. If being easy has slowly made you invisible, that's information, not a failure. You don't have to explode to reclaim yourself. You don't have to justify your boundaries with pain. And you don't have to wait for undeniable proof to trust your own awareness. Sometimes the most powerful decision is the quiet one, made long before anyone else realizes a choice has been made. So I'll leave you with this, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever stayed silent to keep something intact, only to realize later that the silence was costing you more than you knew? If this story resonated with you, share your perspective below. Not to vent, not to accuse, but to reflect. Because clarity grows when we name it together.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.